I guess no decade saw more change and upheaval than the 1950s. The war had really left Canadians solidly air-minded. And for the second time, Trans-Canada Airlines struck up the bandwagon. From terminals very much like this one, all across the country, people were climbing aboard. Between the end of the war and 1948, the number of Canadians using air transportation doubled. And by 1950, it had tripled.
For Grant McConachie, the youthful president of the privately run Canadian Pacific, it was time to move. Since his bush pilot days, he'd had a vision which spanned oceans.
McConachie had what today would be called charisma. He had the remarkable ability to mesmerize people. This was a combination of personality plus his fantastic enthusiasm for and belief in the future of aviation. And he wasn't just a wild-eyed dreamer, because his visions of the future of aviation were remarkably practical and very much before his time.
McConachie's chief rival was himself a go-getter, Gordon McGregor, who had astonished his peers by flying in the Battle of Britain as a fighter pilot when he was 40 years old. C.D. Howe, the so-called Minister of Everything and founding father of TCA, appointed McGregor president of the airline with one firm guideline.
Mr. McGregor was very determined to keep his hands out of the public purse. He had such a strong insight into what he believed to be the role of Air Canada and his role in building it. It was a mission with him. He was almost like a missionary. He was almost the ideal man to face the McConachie threat, because they were alike yet so unalike in many ways.
The threat McConachie posed was competition. TCA, born in 1937, had had all the marbles to itself under protective law until 1942, and that's when Canadian Pacific surfaced, having quietly bought up 10 private companies to take total control of commercial flying in the north. Still, things remained peaceful until 1949, when McConachie saw a chance to give his global dreams substance. Canadian Pacific was granted a route to the Orient. TCA didn't want it. They figured CP would lose its shirt, which it almost did, until a new war broke out.
Fortunately for our economic fortunes, the Korean War came along. We were able to make a favorable charter contract with the U.S. government for the carriage of troops and materiel, and that did save us economically.
During the 50s, Canadian Pacific spread its wings around the world. McConachie was flying high.
He could foresee the application of the long-range airliner in using what he called the Great Circle routes, the short distances over the roof of the world instead of around the bulge of the world.
At that time, and for a long time afterwards, this was the airplane that millions and millions of people thought of when they heard the word airliner, the DC-3.
Almost 45 years since it was on the drawing boards, and lots of them still going strong. It was the first airliner that I was a passenger in, from Toronto to Ottawa. Low and slow, and comfortable. The old DC-3 still grumbles along, and lots of them still flying. Unlike the North Star, which followed them into Air Canada's skies and is now mercifully gone. I remember pounding across the prairies in my first North Star trip and coming out of it at the end with scar tissue in my eardrums. Those two airplanes had to fly through the weather. They couldn't go high enough to escape the tall summer cumulus clouds. I remember the excitement with which a pilot told me coming back from, it was Saskatoon or Lethbridge or someplace, about the new plane that was coming, the Viscount, that would fly above the weather and had a whine that was so peculiar in its turbines that it scared all the rats out of the terminal buildings and airports.
Viscount was followed by a bigger turboprop aircraft called the Vanguard. Everything rattled in the Vanguard, even the stewardesses rattled. That was the only airplane I ever traveled in on several occasions in which at least one engine stopped. After a while, those would all yield, of course, to the new jets, but a lot of us remember fondly the old airplanes that grumbled and rattled and evolved and turned Canada into a much narrower country. But it was the jet, with its new dimensions of speed, which finally transformed us. It quickened the bloodstream of business and politics and gave us what one thinker called the global village. It gave birth to a new leisure class that we called the jet set. Some of us couldn't wait to emulate these beautiful people, and the airlines moved quickly to acquire jets so we could do that. In Canada, Canadian Pacific had tried to get the jump on TCA, ordering one of the ill-starred Comets. That hadn't worked. TCA would be first with the DC-8, but it was a typical move in a commercial duel which continues into the present time. In the late 50s, it was still an uneven contest. At home, Canadian Pacific was little more than a high-class bush line. But that was to change dramatically. In 1958, within a year of taking power, John Diefenbaker's Conservative government called for competition on domestic air routes. And to be sure of getting it, Transport Minister George Hees hired Stephen Wheatcroft, a Briton who specialized in airline economics.
The case for having competitive service was quite limited, but that there was a special situation in which Canadian Pacific was operating a network of services, international services, out of Vancouver, and another small network of international services out of Toronto, and it made very good sense to allow a connecting flight domestically between these two networks.
McGregor, playing against a stacked deck, lost that one to McConachie. But there was a bigger shock ahead, from an unexpected source, the Liberal government of Lester B. Pearson.
We had to make up our minds when the new government came in, whether we would allow CP Air to stay in that service or give Air Canada back the monopoly. After a lot of careful consideration, I reached the conclusion, and the government agreed with me, that the public liked to have a choice.